Steve, absolute pleasure to have you here on the Housing Collective podcast. Thank you for joining us. For the listeners, can you give us a brief introduction to yourself and your organisation?
Well, it's great to be here, Tom, and talk to you. And well, where do I start? I feel like I'm getting older by the day, but aren't we all? So I'm Steve Coffey, the Group Chief Executive of Torus, and we're quite a large association in the Northwest. Predominantly, well, solely in the Northwest, predominantly in our key heartland areas of Liverpool, St Helens and Warrington, but stretching across the Northwest and what really a reasonably sized footprint, whilst we've still got 40,000 homes. So we get the benefits of scale in a locality and the benefits of being quite a large organisation too.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Steve. And can you share with us a bit about your journey to becoming CEO of Torus? Because clearly you've gone through, as we all know, you've gone through a bit of a journey from Liverpool Mutual Homes and now Torus. So can you tell us a bit more about that journey?
Well, I think that journey is important, I think, particularly in the context of professionalisation in the sector and everything else, because I wasn't a traditional housing person. I started life in civil engineering and then ended up going back and studying law at university and came into housing through regen, development assets, that kind of area. So having done that, I then got my first executive job in 2000, it had been out, just as the turn of the millennium. And I was working in the Midlands as a property development assets director down there. Was always going to come back to the Northwest really and back to Liverpool fundamentally in that area. So came back from there to with a similar role in a large organisation in Liverpool City region, and then got my first chief executive job as Liverpool Mutual Homes, and that was really important to me because I grew up in what was then a Liverpool council property. My mother lived in a Liverpool council property, not one of our properties, another association all through her life, and really that was an emotional attraction to that too, as well as a professional attraction, obviously. And I was delighted to get my first job. And then with LMH then, from 2008 when we stock transferred through to 2019 when we had the amalgamation. I mean, I couldn't have been more emotionally engaged in that business than if I was an owner of a business, to be fair. Yeah. And we did some really good things. I'm not suggesting them up for one moment. We got things right all the time, because we absolutely didn't. But I think we, in broad terms, did a decent job and made a significant change to social housing in Liverpool. Then in 2019, we amalgamated with what we call Old Torus or Legacy Torus, which was a joining of Golden Gates in Warrington, where I'm sitting today, and Helena Housing, which is in St Helens, to create the new Torus that we've got today in our new group.
That's brilliant. What a great background, Steve. What a great background. And just, you talk about that. I didn't even know you kind of civil engineer background, but I think you obviously did that, then law, and clearly there's that emotional piece, not only to Liverpool City region, but obviously kind of that personal link as well. So just going through that, and then obviously those 15 years of being the chief executive, how do you feel that's shaped your leadership style? And do you think your background as well has shaped the way that you lead the organisation?
I think it does, because authenticity is important to me, and I think to be a good leader, you've got to be authentic. There isn't an identikit process that you do to create a leader, or there isn't a sort of a set profile. We all need to use our own personalities, our own attributes, be emotionally intelligent enough to understand what our strengths are and what our areas of not so strong and areas for development are, and it's deploying the various tactics and various strategies and various approaches, but in an authentic way, and that's authentic to you. And also knowing what you're not good at and gathering people around you who plug those gaps, because one of the main things for me was not to appoint people in a senior team through the organisation that are identikits of me. I love people who are different to me, to be fair, because that gives you a much more richer breadth of talents and breadth of approaches and breadth of personalities, which cumulatively give you that much richer and better leadership style. And that's developed over that period and earlier than that, I suppose. And sometimes you've got to be very directing, and there's certainly times that call for that. And then there's other times where you need to sit back and let other people prosper and flourish and develop things through the process.
Yeah, and that goes on to my next question, Steve, actually, just in relation to being adaptable. And you look at, you have been a chief exec now for over 15 years. You will have seen many an executive team come and go through those 15 years. So from your perspective, you talk there, you have a different skill set to others that you look for. But what do you specifically look for when you're recruiting in your exec team?
I think it's funny, isn't it? Because lots of people say, recruit for attitudes and all this stuff, which became a bit trendy approach, if that makes sense. And absolutely, that's important. And sort of personality and approach and attitude and all those things are vital elements. But there's got to be a core competence as well. And so really, there's a benchmark for me of core competence. We want people who are really, really good at what they do, or have got the potential to be really, really good, because that's important too. And then build on the top of that people with a good attitude, a good personality, a good strategic fit. All of those things are vital. But there's got to be both of those things. There's got to be a good technical competence for the specialisms and areas that we've got, but also there's got to be that right personality too.
You talk about personality there, Steve. I'm really keen to get your thoughts here, because Torus is an ambitious organisation, which we'll go on to in more detail later on. But it's so important that we have ambitious colleagues in our organisations, but also high-performing colleagues. However, how do you encourage people to work towards the common goal rather than their own career ambitions?
That's a balance. I think in any role, in any job we're in, there's probably, these proportions maybe aren't right, but there's 10% of our jobs that we love. That's our fields of fascination. That's the thing we really sort of switch us on. There's 80% that we're great, we're fine with, and there's probably 10% that we know we've got to do, but it doesn't really give us that buzz, but we know we've got to get on with it. And we all have those elements, no matter what the job is. It's made up, the proportions might be different, but it's important that we recognise there are those different elements. And you've got to give people a scope. For everyone, there's got to be enough of the really good 10%, the fields of fascination, to make people engaged and want to do it. For the other element that they might not to buy into and drive forward. And on the top of that, it is about, for me, I would love to think in 10, 20 years' time, there's a whole alumni of people who've come to Torus, been helped, been cherished, been fostered, been developed, and have gone on to do magnificent things, whether that's with us or whether that's with someone else. It's about putting that positive influence on people, and that's really important. That says something about an organisation. So for me, if you give people that potential to grow and develop, then people will certainly buy into that sort of corporate strategy and ethos.
Definitely, and it was really interesting actually, Steve, because we had Fiona Fletcher-Smith on the podcast earlier, and she was saying, as a chief exec or as a senior leader, in effect, you are a curator or a trustee for the organisation, and your job is to leave the organisation in a better place than when you picked it up. And I think that's really true there, where you look back at the alumni of Torus, hopefully they have taken that organisation further on in while they've been there.
Yeah, because we are custodians, and it's got to be, that, because it's not an owner sort of business, it's a different model, and it is going to be here long after Steve Coffey or anyone else, to be honest, and it's going to be here long after, hopefully, our current tenants, there's future generations of tenants and future generations of communities and everything else that we need to have a positive impact on. So developing those people right the way through, and we do huge amounts in apprenticeships, for instance. So it's not just executives. Right the way through the organisation, I think it's important that the principles that apply to me in my employment arrangements should apply to everyone else in this organisation. And we're all the same for me. We've got different jobs to do, and that might sound daft. I'm the chief executive, and I get that. But we're all the same. We're all held in equal esteem. We've just got different jobs to do towards that corporate goal, that corporate ethic of making stronger communities, which is our mission at Torus.
And clearly with that, Steve, you've got to naturally be a good team player for everyone to work to that collective goal. So in your opinion, as chief exec, what makes someone a good team player?
to work towards that common goal, to be fair, and to be selfless sometimes, but be authentic too, and be open, because for me, I want people to. I love people who have different opinions. For me, I don't like yes people.
Yeah.
It's much better because, and I'd want to pinch people's ideas wherever I can, because quite often the better,
Yeah.
if not always. But equally, I want people to voice. For me, again, I want people treated in our organisation the same I would with the board. If I thought we should follow a certain strategy, and we had that discussion at the board, and I had my opportunity to put my case forward, and the board said, yeah, we hear all that, but we want to go down a different route. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with the fact that I've had the opportunity to express my thoughts and views. And the same way I'd want our executive team to do that. I want all our staff to do that. It doesn't mean we're going to follow them all the time, but I certainly want them to feel comfortable in expressing their views. And I do think that's a way of getting people to buy in to things. If people get the opportunity to express their thoughts and views, even if and they see a logic for taking a different route, even if it's not the route they would have chosen, then people do tuck behind that collective view and that collective responsibility. And that's a positive, healthy organisation for me.
Yeah, without a shadow of a doubt. And you mentioned some key aspects there, Steve, around authenticity, being selfless at times as well. From a recruitment perspective, how do you find those qualities during an interview process? Because you'll probably meet someone a couple of times for an hour each time for a coffee. How do you really dig those skills out?
Well, that's tough, and I think inevitably you make some mistakes along the way. I've been really fortunate in my career as a chief executive. I've very stable senior teams right the way through. I'd like to think that's because people like working with me and as part of the team and what we're doing. But equally, I think I've got an open relationship with people that if they wanted to get on and take a job somewhere else, I would help them. And I know that sounds massive. That sounds daft in some ways. Even if it would cause us a problem, why are they different to me? I'd help and support and be as positive as I can. And through an interview process, it's hard to find those kinds of relationships thing. So it's about having a broad enough series of tests. And I don't mean sort of, personality tests. I mean, they've got a place, relationships, interviews, a whole different types of arrangements where you can tap into different parts of people's personalities. But quite often it's a feel as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's about whether people get on.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously that comes with experience as well, doesn't it? So I completely understand that. And if we take it back and talk about the organisation now, Steve, you mentioned at the beginning that back in 2019, you merged with Torus to become, at the time, a 39,000 registered provider, which is a significant player in the Northwest. So can you just talk to us about that journey of merging with Torus?
Well, it came about because in LMH, where I was previously to the amalgamation, obviously, we had a view that we wanted to be bigger, not for the sake of being bigger, not that we can. It's more sexy being a chief executive of a 40,000 association than a 16,000 association, but more about how can we take the business model we've got and apply that over a bigger footprint, get the economies of scale in terms of cost, in terms of financial capacity and everything else, but make sure that we remain embedded in the communities that we're working in, because we didn't want to be bigger for the sake of it. We wanted to be bigger to get those benefits of scale, to get those benefits of access to capital markets and the like. But we equally wanted to be based in our communities. And we're fundamentally 3 stock transfer associations. So the ethos amongst them all is broadly the same. The business model might be a bit different now than what old legacy Torus had. But the fundamental principles are we're a stock transfer, we're embedded in those communities, and we want to remain embedded in those communities. And if we can bring more efficiency, more resources through our gift aid model with our commercial activities or our development aspirations, or just being an anchor institution in those places, then more the better.
Yeah, brilliant. And I'm really keen just to go into that kind of 2019, 2020 stage, Steve, there as well, because you merged with the legacy Torus, but legacy Torus was already a relatively newly formed merger between Golden Gates and Elena Partnerships, as we spoke about. So, given the current economic climate, M&A is clearly high on the agenda. So, I'm sure people will be really keen to understand how did you motivate that existing staff who had already been through quite a significant change already just a few years prior?
Yeah, that was an issue, inevitably. But I think one thing we should recognise is it had Helena and Golden Gate had merged, but it was a wash and line arrangement, so the organisation themselves hadn't merged together. They were still two separate entities. With our merger, we could easily have tagged LMH on that wash and line as another entity, but we wouldn't have realised those benefits financially and culturally and everything else. So one of my approaches is keeping things as simple and as straightforward as possible. That's always better. So we amalgamated all the three landlords into one single entity, and our group structure is very, very simple. We don't have different businesses for the sake of it. We only have businesses if there's a tax reason, if there's a Vides reason, if there's a regulation reason. There's got to be a reason why we have different entities. Otherwise, we will collapse them all and make it as simple and as straightforward as possible. So we did come to that. And one of the things we had, for instance, that we just implemented a new computer system, or old Torus had just implemented a new computer system. So we retained that system. So that made things easier over that period. And we had a two and a bit year integration program, which we drove through that process to make those procedures and processes and get that buy-in from people during that time. And we tried really hard to make real significant progress in that respect. And I think we did, and we delivered all the things that we'd said in that transformation program over that period of time. And that was important to us. But inevitably, I think one of the downsides of us, whoever was the operational director over an area, if that was someone from old Torus, the old LMH people felt it was more Torus.
Yeah.
And if it was LMH, the old Torus people felt it was more LMH. And that was a big cultural piece that we had to do. And if I'm honest, that's taken longer than it should and could, because unfortunately we had this little thing called a pandemic in the meantime.
It's a tiny one. Yeah.
Right after we transferred, we had a pandemic. And culturally, it's about seeing people. It's about reality. And all of a sudden, for a couple of years, people are sitting at home predominantly and not integrating in the same way. So there was challenges as a consequence of that.
Definitely. And just talk about the pandemic there then, Steve. Everyone had those challenges, but you were probably exaggerated challenges given that you just gone through the merger. So what were the challenges and how did you overcome them?
I think it was culturally getting people, new teams, people who didn't know each other as well, getting them integrated together was a big issue. And how we overcome them? Well, we worked very hard and took every opportunity to get people together. We've just recently had our first group staff conference, which involved everybody. We had to hold it over 2 days, actually, because we've got 2,000 employees now across all our group. And we couldn't find a venue to fit them all in one go. So we held it over the course of 2 days, half one day, half the following day with the same format and everything else. And the upside of that is the impact on our services was much less on those days because we could keep going over that period. So that was a great opportunity for people to get together. And that social, softer stuff, not just the work environment, not just team meetings, that softer stuff is important. And we've got a big program now to make sure we integrate that we reinforce our values, which are we care, we own as we deliver. And that's very much our values, and they apply to every part of our group, whether it's a very commercial, our contracting arm carrying out on a commercial basis works for other people. Those principles are still the same. We still want to own it. We still want to care. We still want to deliver, whether that's a commercial opportunity with someone else or whether that's looking after one of our tenants and someone in our communities.
Yeah, interesting. And just, I asked this to the majority of the guests on the podcast, Steve, is that going to around the merger, you mentioned there that one of the big drivers was economies of scale and also better access or more access to those capital markets. Naturally, given the economic uncertainty, M&A is still a priority for boards. So, looking back at that merger that you've undertaken over the last couple of years, do you have any advice to CEOs and boards having those first discussions with other organisations?
The first thing I'd say, don't do it when there's a pandemic going to come along straight afterwards, but hopefully no one else will suffer that in the same way.
Yeah.
I think I have a very clear transformation program and integration program afterwards, and keep to it. And we did, and we took more than £14 million a year out of running costs as a consequence. But we've put more than that into our investments in our existing stock. So, for instance, we'll spend this current financial year over £100 million on our existing stock. So they're big development. We've got massive development programs, so big opportunities and big benefits for people. But what I would say is have that clarity around the integration, be single-minded, and drive things through as quickly and as efficiently, whilst giving due care as you possibly can.
Yeah, great. And just on Torus, you mentioned this a second ago, Steve, is that also, along with being a significant social landlord in the north, you're also a really large developer, which undertakes some really interesting commercial and non-housing charitable activities. But given the social housing white paper, how do you ensure that those other activities don't take away the focus from your core purpose?
Well, we're fundamentally a social landlord and always will be. So the approach we've taken is we've got core, complementary and support services for us. And the core is being a landlord. So, housing management, assets, repairs, maintenance, all those things that we do as a social landlord. That's our core purpose. That's what we will always be. On top of that, then, we're a commercial developer. So we've got over 2,500 homes on site or in contract at the moment. We've got a great opportunity in North Warrington, not far from where I am now, which is the largest site in the Northwest with Vistry PLC that we're delivering through a joint venture. And they'll be commercially successes. I'm sure they will be, and we'll make sure they are. On the other side, we've got our commercial contracting arm, HMS, which again is a commercial contractor, not a DLO as such. And I'll explain that a bit more in a moment, because people will think, people say that all the time. It's not a DLO, but it is. The reality is with HMS, again, a turnover of over £100 million, working not just for ourselves, but for other housing associations, other public bodies, other private sector clients on a commercial basis. And we actually went through an ODU compliant tender process fairly recently, because in our model, there's no point in saying HMS makes profits. And I looked before the podcast, since 2011 when we set HMS up, it's actually give £22.5 million in gift aid through profits. Wow. Now, that's a huge amount of money that it's gift aided. If that was a case of we're paying, there's no point HMS making £3 million profit because Torus is paying £3 million over the odds. That's not real money, that's wooden dollars. Whereas if it's a commercial contract paying a market rate and it makes profits, then that's real money, that's real resources coming into the organisation. And so we went through a procurement process, and HMS needed to bid with the market, and it did, and it was successful through that process. And we've just issued a new contract to HMS going forward. So we then get the benefits through gift aid, we get the benefits through VAT, and it's in our VAT group, so we get the benefits around that. And in our model, HMS and Torus Developments, our development business, they gift aid the money to Torus Foundation. And within the model, Torus Foundation is in many ways the jewel in the crown. It's because I'd say, as a landlord, we're about giving someone a decent home to live in. And I don't mean a decent home, standard home. I mean a proper place to live. And we all know what that means. We don't need a decent home standard to tell us that. We need to give, and we don't always get that right, particularly damp and mould and everything else now, and we're putting massive resources in. But that needs to be the basic, and that's what, as a a group and as Torus, as a landlord, we need to do. But what the foundation does is it goes beyond that to change people's lives. Because if you're a single parent, for instance, living in a nice home, and you can't get the kids' uniforms, or you're struggling with utility bills, or you can't get some presents on birthdays and all, that's still a pretty poor existence. What the Torus Foundation does is builds on that nice home people live in to change people's lives. So looks after vulnerable people, engaged with young people. So we run the Super Youth Zone in Liverpool, for instance, that we engage with thousands of young people on an outreach basis from there, and that's done through the foundation. Young, vulnerable people, making sure that people are financially included, digitally included. All of those things are a massive health and wellbeing, massive benefits and objectives for us. And then worklessness, addressing worklessness, employment opportunities, making sure that people can use that decent home, nice home, as a foundation, sorry for the pun, a foundation for the rest of their lives. And that's that's the sweet spot of our group, I think. But equally in the group, we've all got to do our job properly, our own job properly.
And it's great to see, Steve, because you seem so passionate and really proud about the operating model that you've created there. I mean, I'm really interested because you see from the outside looking in within across the UK that there are some times when this gets the cultural indifference gets so badly wrong when you have those commercial subsidiaries. So is there a cultural balance to be achieved between the charitable and commercial parts of the group?
There is, but that's about staying in role. That's about all doing our jobs, because we can apply those same principles about caring, owning, delivering. But that's going to mean something very different in the commercial contracting business as it will do in our housing management service. That doesn't mean culturally it's different. The culture and the ethos is the same, but how it manifests itself might be different. So, for instance, there will be in HMS, a portion of those profits are shared by the employees of the organisation. Now, that's not appropriate in a social landlord. It's different. It's just a different set of circumstances. Terms and conditions for our employees are different in a commercial entity than they are in our charitable social landlords and those entities. So we apply the same principles, and in the round, they're equally as good, but how it manifests itself will be different.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. That's fascinating to know. And onto yourself, Steve. You run a very busy business and a very kind of successful business as well. So, not to add to your kind of workload, back in April 2022, you were appointed the chair of the Homes for the North, just to go on with that extra workload. So, can you just talk to us in a bit more detail about what that role entails?
Well, Homes for the North is the 18 largest developing associations across the North, and it's linked into that. So whether it's Northern Powerhouse, Northern Way, all those initiatives, the rebalancing the economy, levelling up, it's all the same thing, and it's very much about what do we need to look at on a pan-Northern basis rather than just, let's say, a Liverpool City region basis or a West Yorkshire basis or whatever the case may be. So we come together as chief executives on that footprint, and we've got a very focused remit, a very focused mission, which is about having new and better homes, which is very much looking at housing as a subset of economic growth, so that we can look at what does each economic growth proposition in an area like Liverpool City region or Warrington, Cheshire, what do they need to boost that economy, and what's the housing offer that needs to come with that, and how do we work with others, whether it's public sector bodies, whether it's Metro Mayors, whether it's the private sector, to make sure we have got a housing offer to support that growth prospect going forward.
And doing my research, Steve, the focus for Homes for the North is very much around, as you say there, but more and better homes. So how does that relate to the levelling up agenda?
Well, more and better, I mean, that's regeneration's a sweet spot in there. So it's not just about developing new homes. Quite often in lots of the great northern cities, regeneration is crucial because there is a very old stock, and the investments that's needed there might not be just about retrofitting, for instance. It might be about regeneration, might be repurposing, might be demolishing properties and coming up with a new offer that fits that community's needs and that economy's needs. So Homes of the North, it's about getting that balance between, yes, increasing supply of a range of tenures that support that economic growth proposition. But also, it's not just more homes, it's better homes. So making sure that the homes we've got are fit for purpose, and where they need to be repositioned or repurposed, that we can contribute to that agenda too.
From your perspective, you talk about the levelling up agenda. Do you see it as a north versus south divide?
No, and the Homes of the North have done created an index. Did a big piece of work, lots of research. A big aspect of Homes of the North is having an evidence-based approach to propositions. Very much we were focused on the 80-20 rule from Homes England that was detrimental to the North. But it's not just about the North, because we did the levelling up index. And if you look at, there's lots of coastal areas in the South, for instance, round the sort of southern East Coast areas and the like, where massive levelling up requirements. So we don't see it as a sort of an us and them for North and South. We see it as, if the whole country, UK PLC, is going to contribute economically, we need to do that rebalancing, as Michael Heseltine called it quite so long ago. That we need to make sure there's no stone unturned, to make sure that we get everyone firing at the full capacity, so that the UK PLC is functioning economically well, and that all our communities can share in that resource in a much more equal, egalitarian kind of way.
Definitely. That's really useful to know. Thank you, Steve. And what are the priorities for the Homes for the North over the next 12 months and for you as chair?
Well, we're focusing on delivering the homes we've got, and between us, we've got a huge development programme collectively. I'm meeting with those opportunities in sub-regional areas like the Liverpool City region. For instance, we've got a really close relationship with Homes England to deliver that. The majority of our members are strategic partners with Homes England, so collectively we're a big vehicle to deliver those outcomes. But also policy-wise, things like, we want to make sure that there's not a perverse outcome in relation to the infrastructure levy and things like that, that we've got a bit of a policy perspective on those areas too.
Yeah, brilliant. Great. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing how it all progresses over the next year, Steve. So thank you so much for joining the Housing Collective podcast, Steve. Before I let you go, we do have some quick fire questions all around leadership. So what has been the most valuable leadership lesson that you've learned?
To be true to yourself. And that's back to the authenticity point we were talking about before. I think if you've got to be comfortable inside to be good outside, I think. So it is very much about being true to yourself. And yes, and be willing to accept advice from others and change tack in those circumstances, while still being authentic to where we are. So being open to views all the time, but being authentic to yourself.
Brilliant. And what advice would you give to an aspiring leader starting out on their journey?
That be authentic again. I know I'm repeating myself a little here, but certainly would do that. But equally, have the stamina, because life's not always in a straight line, is it? Sometimes it is one step forward, two steps back. But if you are authentic, if you are true to yourself, if you are focused on your vision, then there might be some setbacks along the way. But equally, if you're good enough, you'll get there. And if you can create an organisation around that, the organisation will get there too.
Yeah, brilliant. And obviously we are going through quite a challenging outlook at the moment, Steve. So what do you believe are the key leadership qualities required in today's world?
Inclusive, be inclusive of thoughts and views and opinions of other people, a bit as inclusive as possible, and make sure that you're not suffering from groupthink sometimes as well. That can be a difficulty. And don't be afraid to change your mind. Don't be afraid to change tack, because principles are one thing. You know what you're doing. Strategies and tactics are something else, aren't they? Principles, I don't think my principles have been the same all my life. And, without giving a sob story, my dad died when I was very young, and my mum, me and my siblings, had that work ethic. You work hard, and if you're any good, you do well in the long term. And that is important. They're principles. Tactically and strategically, you need to navigate your way through the good times and the bad times to make sure you can apply those principles for the better of everybody.
Yeah, but stick to those principles. I think that's great advice. Thanks, Steve. The final question is, one leadership book recommendation you give to the listeners?
That's a good one, isn't it? I suppose I should come out with something, very leadership, like Stephen Covey, 7 Habits, or something like that, I suppose. But that'll be a bit trite, I think. For me, I like looking at people who are brilliant and saying, what can you learn from them? And I've recently read Barack Obama's autobiography. And okay, that's an autobiography, not a leadership book. But in reading that, there's a huge amount of leadership sort of elements in there, and things you can take away and think, well, actually, obviously he's looking at the free world when he's making the decisions he's making, but there's tactics and strategies and approaches and techniques and just all those things that you can take from that and apply in a much more micro context, whether that's Torus or whether that's in our own lives as much as anything else. So I'd say that's had a big influence lately on me.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Steve. I was quite happy you didn't say an Evertonian autobiography then, but so we'll go with Barack Obama.
Yeah, given the fact that very recently I've been terrified of us not being in the Premier League anymore, quoting something from Everton might not be the best way forward. Might not be the best one.
Yeah, for any new aspiring leader. Brilliant. Steve, thank you ever so much, and I really appreciate you joining us on the Housing Collective podcast. I look forward to seeing you soon.
Cheers. Thanks, Tom. Take care.